grad coordinator. And with me tonight, co-hosting, we have Medea Benjamin, co-founder of CODEPINK, and Hania Jodat Barnes, who's been with us for years now. We have a great lineup tonight. We're going to be talking about Latin America, from Cuba to Colombia, Viva, all those places in between as well, particularly Mexico, because we have guests from Mexico City, just to go over some of the norms so that we're clear on what we can do and what we shouldn't do. And that is to always show respect to everybody. You know, in the chat, say what you mean, but don't be mean, and try to stay on topic with what we're talking about. Just that's really the bottom line. Also, I wanted to review the agenda with you. Please do mute yourself if you're not on camera here. Okay, so tonight we will have some news updates as we usually do, and then we'll go into a conversation with our two guests from Mexico City, Terry Mattson, a longtime activist with our Latin America team, a podcaster. What the F is going on in Latin America? That's her podcast. And Jose Luis Granados Ceja, who's an anti-imperialist journalist and podcaster. With that, we will open it up to questions after we have some conversation, and then you can pose questions in the chat. The second half of our program, Medea Benjamin, who's our co-host, will then transition to be a guest. She just arrived from Cuba. Another trip to Cuba. She's been there many times delivering humanitarian aid. This time she was attending a conference. She'll tell us about that, about Guantanamo and all things Cuban. So with that, let's get started with our news updates. Let's go to Medea. She's oftentimes on Capitol Hill. She can tell us what's going on.
Well, yes, I think everybody's heads are spinning with what the Trump administration has been doing with just 2 weeks in office. And you've probably followed the raiding of the Treasury and going inside and getting people's private data, and the shutting down of AID and bringing it into the State Department, and people being extremely upset about certain programs that have been shut down. Some of us never liked AID's programs about regime change, but there have been good programs as well, like helping HIV/AIDS in Africa, supporting people in the rainforest, all kinds of other programs. Unfortunately, I think the redoing of AID that Donald Trump wants to do is to take away everything that actually helps people and instead just have the regime change programs. So we are in for some more bumpy times. Tonight, there was a big protest outside the Treasury Department where the Democrats suddenly appeared, many of them, and lots of senators came and members of Congress, all saying that Elon Musk was not elected, that this is a soft coup against the government, against the people in Congress who are supposed to be the ones that decide what money goes where. And we shall see what comes of that. But one of the chants I liked the best was shut down the Senate. I don't know who started that, but it was great to see everybody yelling, shut down the Senate. Now, we might all have different reasons about why we would want to shut down the Senate, but I thought that was a great chant. Netanyahu's visit, I mean, what an affront to have the first head of state to visit Donald Trump be somebody for whom there is an arrest warrant out by the highest court of the land, the International Criminal Court. And we've just seen press conference that they held together in which Donald Trump is out of his mind, talking about how the people of Gaza are going to leave and be taken in, not just by Egypt and Jordan, by all these other countries in the region that are anxious to help. Meanwhile, all the countries in the region say, no way, we are not going to do that. And of course, the people inside of Gaza are saying, no way. But Donald Trump talks about it as a beautiful piece of land that will be the Riviera of the Middle East. And it's a terrible, terrible affront to the people who have suffered so long, not just for these the last year and a half, but for many decades. We also know that Donald Trump has lifted the restrictions on 2,000-pound bombs. and asked Congress to authorize another $1 billion in weapons, including lots of 1,000-pound bombs and including these armed bulldozers that have been used to raze the homes of people in both the Gaza and the West Bank. And we know that Netanyahu is always pushing for the U.S. to be involved in a war with Iran, and that both leaders have said a nuclear Iran is just unacceptable. And we hate to think of what they are cooking up to make sure that doesn't happen. And then I also think that they are talking about whether phase 2 and phase 3 of the ceasefire are actually going to happen. We know that Netanyahu does not want phase 2 to happen, even though they're negotiating it right now, because that would mean that the Israeli troops would be leaving Gaza, and he doesn't want that to happen. So we don't know what's going to happen with phase 2. And phase 3 is the rebuilding of Gaza, which Trump has all kinds of crazy ideas about rebuilding it without the people of Gaza. So those are some of the updates. And one more thing, on the one positive thing, is that the border at Rafah has been opened, and that there have been people who have medical emergencies, particularly children, who have been allowed to leave. Not enough, but at least there is the possibility that more will be allowed out in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea Benjamin, co-founder of CODEPINK. And to add to the list of positive news, I know it's a skinny list, but I'm reading the Hill's report is that Congress has placed a hold on Trump's request for $1 billion in arms for Israel. It doesn't really go into why, but we know that they're pretty upset about, well, the Democrats at least, about the defunding, Trump's intention to defund or otherwise alter USAID. And I'm sure some of them are pretty upset about just having funded it all along, the genocide. So with
Yes,
that,
Marcy,
yes.
that would be the minority leaders in both the House and the Senate Foreign Affairs and Foreign Relations Committees. So Jean Shaheen and Gregory Meeks. So if anybody on your own wants to give them a call and say, keep that hold going, that would be great.
Absolutely. And, surprisingly, Jean Shaheen, I think she's from New Hampshire, not a radical, certainly not on the lunatic left, as Trump would describe. She voted against the last arms package to Israel, or
And
yeah, so.
Yeah, let's not forget, while we're talking about this 1 billion, there's still 8 billion that was promised by Biden right before he left that is still in the hopper. So we're going to have to work on opposing that as well.
Thank you, Medea. A few other quick updates from me. The Senate Finance Committee advanced Robert Kennedy Jr.'s nomination as the leader of the Department of Health and Human Services. That was along party lines. The same can be said for advancing Tulsi Gabbard, her nomination. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence voted 9-8 along party lines to send her confirmation vote to the floor. I was watching the hearing with Tulsi Gabbard, and I was just like, it should have been called the hearing on Edward Snowden, because almost every question was about, tell us right now, was Edward Snowden a traitor? Yes or no? And to her credit, she refused to answer that and said, Edward Snowden broke the law. There was a massive illegal wiretapping scheme underway. She said, if confirmed, I will make sure that those who work in the intelligence community, and there are 18 different agencies under the Director of National Intelligence, that they have an avenue to me, so they don't have to be whistleblowers. We also know that she has had very harsh words for pro-Palestine protesters at colleges across the country, saying they're under the thumb of Hamas or something to that effect. What else is going on? China has placed counter tariffs on U.S. imports that will come into effect in February 10th, after Trump places 10% levies on Chinese goods that are already being levied. China has also announced that it is investigating Google. It looks like, at least for now, for another month, Trump's threat to impose tariffs on Mexico and Canada are on the back burner. He reached agreements with Sheinbaum in Mexico. I'm sure we'll be hearing about that in our conversation between Terry and Jose Luis. And according to one report, Trudeau agreed that Canada would name a fentanyl czar, list Mexican cartels as terrorist groups, which is pretty dangerous given that that might be an open door for military intervention by the US, and has launched a Canada-US joint strike force to combat organized crime, fentanyl, and money laundering. That's my update. Hania, yours.
Thank you, Marcy. Moving on to flawed immigration policies, the Trump administration is ramping up its attacks on immigrant communities, vowing to carry out the largest mass deportation in the US history, targeting 11.7 million undocumented people. He's also trying to rewrite longstanding immigration policies. He issued an executive order calling for the use of armed forces, physical barriers, drones, and new strategies to block unauthorized entry at the southern border. He even signed an executive order that threatened student visas for international students who were involved in pro-Palestinian activism on college campuses, and ended protection that limited arrest in sensitive areas and locations like schools and in churches. But one of the most alarming moves is Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship. Under this order, starting February 9th, 2025, which is this year, children born in the US will only be granted citizenship if at least one parent is a US citizen or a green card holder. This executive order is being currently challenged in court. Trump's so-called executive order protecting the American people against invasion targets sanctuary cities by denying them federal funding. His executive order guaranteeing the state's protection agents against invasion invokes Article 4 of the Constitution to block all entry at the southern border, even for asylum seekers. But the one thing that I'm very happy to see is that people aren't standing by quietly. On Monday, many U.S. businesses closed in protest for a day without immigrants. Thousands of people have taken to the streets, including in Southern California, where demonstrations have blocked a major freeway in Los Angeles for several hours. The biggest protests are happening now in California and in Texas along the border and near government buildings. And many of these protests are led by students. If you know someone and if you need support, check out CodePink's Know Your Rights Immigration Toolkit, which we're more than happy to share with you all in the chat. And yeah, Marcy, handing it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive report. Yeah, we have a terrific pink card that can be passed out in your city that says Know Your Rights, both in English and Spanish. So check out the Code Pink Toolkit for immigration and Know Your Rights. All right, let's get started with our guests, our very special guests, Terry Mattson, Jose Luis Granados Ceja. First, I'll introduce Terry, and then Hania will introduce Jose Luis. All right, introduced to Mesoamerican anthropology and archaeology in the 6th grade, Terry's lifelong passion for Latin America and the Caribbean has inspired 40 plus years of travel throughout the region. The past few years include organizing or participating in electoral, political, and social justice delegations to Argentina, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Peru, and Venezuela. Terry currently works with the Mexico Solidarity Project's media team. She is affiliated with the Venezuela Solidarity Network. She is an activist with the Sanctions Kill Coalition and a volunteer with Latin America's team. She also hosts and produces the YouTube podcast, which is now on hiatus, but we're going to encourage her to come back. What the F is going on in Latin America? So Terry's coming to us from Mexico City, as is Jose Luis, and Honey is going to introduce Jose.
It brings me nothing but great pleasure to introduce Jose Luis Granados Ceja, who is an anti-imperialist journalist and a political analyst based in Mexico City, with over 20 years of experience covering social movements, democracy, elections, and human rights. He is the staff writer with Venezuela Analysis, covering regional and international issues, and hosts their podcast. He also writes a monthly opinion column for Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin. Together with Kurt Hackbarth, he co-hosts the Soberania podcast, which provides English language analysis of politics in Mexico. Starting this year, you can also watch him on Sin Muros, a new Spanish language news show analyzing the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. Welcome to our show.
Yes, wonderful to have you. I'm going to start off with a question, a pretty broad question, and then we'll see where we go from there. So the question is this, there's just a lot of focus right now on Trump's outrageous actions. It's hard to keep up, the raid on the Social Security system and all these attacks on immigrants and renaming the Gulf of Mexico, on and on. So a lot of people are like, oh, this is happening right now. This is just starting. And we know it's not just starting, that there's a long history, right? So my question to you is, what did Trump inherit in terms of US militarization of Latin America?
So you're throwing that at both of us.
Yeah, so go ahead, Terry.
Jose Luis, do you want to start or should I?
No, Terry, go ahead. You.
Okay. Well, so thank you for the invitation to join all of you this evening. And Jose Luis and I are talking to you live from Mexico City, where we have witnessed from the exterior so much of the last 2 weeks of activity coming from the United States. I think, for me, the most important thing for those of us who are US citizens is to really understand that so much of what we have seen directed towards Latin America and the Caribbean since January 20th is not new. It's a continuum. And I think that's really what we have to understand. When you're outside of the United States, it doesn't matter if a bomb has a D for Democrat on it or an R for Republican on it. It's still dropping on your house and killing your family and friends. And this is what we need to understand, this continuum of US foreign policy. So, for instance, with Trump and with Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State, there is a lot of military infrastructure in place since like the 1950s, but really on steroids since Laura Richardson was general of the Southern Command. So from 2021 to she retired October of 2024, she put a lot of military alliances and infrastructure in place throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, we are talking, aside from what already exists, Guatemala, Honduras, alliances with El Salvador, Costa Rica, Panama, Ecuador, and now the Galapagos Islands. Peru, since the coup there. Chile is a wild card. Things happening in Bolivia, Argentina is going to get a new naval port. Brazil has been cooperative militarily. What am I missing, Jose Luis? Colombia has 9 bases. Haiti has listening posts. So it's broad, and this is, what this current administration is inheriting. And so a lot of this was advanced under the prior administration and was existing to certain degrees under multiple prior administrations. So I just think as US citizens, we have to really understand this continuum, because people here in Mexico most certainly do. So maybe Jose Luis, you can speak to that.
Sure, I'll jump in here and give my 2 cents when it comes to what has Trump represented for Mexico. So I absolutely agree with Terry. We saw each other earlier today and we were having a conversation precisely around this. It's what I always like to call the bipartisan imperialist consensus, in the sense that the United States is largely driven by these elite interests, by the ruling class interests that has always treated Latin America as its quote unquote backyard. Obviously, we reject that kind of characterization, but that's how they view us, as a place where there's cheap labor and cheap resources, and we should know our place. And in a lot of ways, there hasn't been much of a difference when there has been a change of the occupant of the White House. And, in some regards, things get a little bit more aggressive, or maybe they get more conspiratorial and a little bit more of the backroom shenanigans. But nonetheless, the aim is still the same: to keep Latin America subjugated, to keep us within their sphere of influence. et cetera, et cetera. I think in some ways, Trump has represented a change for Mexico in the sense that we have seen far more aggressive postures, certainly an effort to try to extract more concessions, a kind of policy approach that very much emphasizes that kind of very paternalistic attitude of treating Latin America as if we're not equals. And one of the things that we've learned over the last few decades, particularly in the first and the second pink tide, has been the importance of sovereignty. We mentioned in the intro, right? There's a reason why Kurt and I decided to name our program Soberanía, sovereignty in Spanish, because, we feel like this is one of the fundamental pillars when we think about Venezuela, when we think about Mexico today, when we think about Nicaragua, Cuba. It's all about defending sovereignty, about this, basically this notion that we can pursue our own economic and political path. But obviously, the United States, US imperialism is not a fan of that. And so what have we seen with Trump when it comes to Mexico? So the big, the elephant in the room is the tariff threats. That was pretty serious, my column that I wrote this month for the Mexico Solidarity Project, I talked about how, in a lot of ways, Mexico's economy has been built around this assumption that everything that implies following the free trade agreement in 1994. It was obviously a very neoliberal arrangement, one that favored precisely that kind of arrangement, where Mexico's place was to, have cheap labor, maquiladoras, resources, Canadian mining projects, of the like, right? But, there was a certain kind of consistency there. And like it or not, when López Obrador came into power in 2018, he was constrained by the neoliberal edifice that existed in this country. Obviously, an effort to transform it, to quite deliberately so, to transform the state, to take it away from, these fundamentals, these pillars of neoliberalism, into a more of a, humanist, developmentalist, post-neoliberal model. But nonetheless, this was the structure that was in place. And then suddenly Trump comes in and he kind of throws it into disarray. These tariff threats are a pretty significant threat to that relationship that exists with North America. And in a lot of ways, it's important to pay attention to what happened. Ultimately, he decided to retract. They've been on pause for a month. And obviously, I think we should also commend Claudia Sheinbaum for everything, her leadership in this position. It's been extraordinary, the way that she was able to negotiate this and avoid these tariffs being imposed on Mexico, at least for the time being. But, now we have a good idea of who we're dealing with, or, that he is willing to follow through on this. The executive order was signed, right? They was ready to go in at midnight on Tuesday. So Mexico has to reconsider, I think, in a lot of ways, these assumptions that it had going into this Trump presidency, of thinking about what it actually means to have this very tight, deeply integrated economy. 80% of our exports go to the United States. What does it look like to build a different kind of arrangement given these circumstances? And so that's kind of the crossroads that Mexico is at. I think one of the things I wanted to mention to this group is that, the fact that Trump was willing to follow through, although he ultimately retracted these tariff threats, tells us that, these other threats that he's made, like unilateral military action inside of Mexico, all of this noise around declaring these organized crime groups transnational terrorist or international terrorist organizations, means that it could be the precursor. It could be the first step towards unilateral military action. And that's really dangerous. And I think that's one of the points that I always try to stress when I speak to anybody who's involved with Latin America solidarity work, is that could happen, right? It would constitute a huge violation of our sovereignty. Obviously, Mexico would never stand for it. You can threaten us with all you want, but we're not going to tolerate the US dropping bombs on civilian populations here in Mexico, or there's, these strike teams, boots on the ground. I think that is beyond acceptable for the Mexican government, which does defend sovereignty greatly. So, I think that's important to pay attention. Who are we dealing with here? But to go back to Terry's point, which is that there is a continuum here. A few months ago, the United States. Now, don't get confused here. I'm not defending this person, but the United States kidnapped El Mayo Zambada. He's a key figure in the Sinaloa cartel. And that state, the state of Sinaloa, has been thrown into disarray. I mean, widespread violence as a result of that action, because then, the different leaders started the rivals and attacking each other. And then, so as usual, right, the United States takes unilateral action, and they still haven't explained to us what happened there. Mexico has been demanding answers, like what were you doing? Who's responsible for this? What did you know? Still no answers. But, we're paying the price, as usual. Mexico's paying the price with the bloodshed. And that's really frustrating because we didn't ask for this to happen. It's by chance that we happen to be neighbors with the United States. This whole insecurity situation in Mexico is driven by the demand for drugs and other substances in the United States. But as always, we pay the price, right? So in this case, what we're seeing is the Democrats were in power. Biden, surely someone in his White House authorized this action. Now we're paying the price. And so we could see something similar with Donald Trump. I wanted to talk about Venezuela, but I feel like I've gone on for a little bit too long, but maybe we can get that. But
can we mention one thing that the president of Mexico did achieve in this back and forth with Trump in the last several days?
Yeah, absolutely.
With definitely the 30-day pause on the tariffs, but unlike any of her predecessors, she did bring formally into the conversation between the Mexico head of state and the U.S. head of state the issue of gun exports from the United States into Mexico. That was huge for her to do. Huge accomplishment. And we'll see where it goes. And then, the other thing that happened today, Jose Luis, was these U.S. surveillance planes flying over Baja or over the Gulf of Mexico between the mainland and the Baja Peninsula. So we're wondering if that's a provocation or some sort of agreed upon mission. So
they're not reporting it here, that's for sure. I haven't read about it, but that's frightening. Hania, did you want to ask a question? Want to ask about Venezuela or other areas of Latin America?
Well, I just wanted to give you, Jose Luis, the platform to talk about Venezuela, but I kind of wanted to understand better, what is the reaction to Trump in Latin America right now from the people of that region?
Yeah, certainly I would say that, Trump is really good at making a lot of noise, and that noise gets attention. And I think a lot of people are certainly paying attention to see, does his bark have bite? Is he really willing to follow through with this? And it's hard to really kind of come to a conclusion when it comes to that. Let's take, a couple of the major things that have happened. We have the case of Mexico, which we just talked about, but ultimately he backed down, did he not? Then we have the case of Colombia, where similarly, for merely wanting to stick up for the human dignity of migrants, I mean, it's bad enough that he's engaging in this mass deportation campaign, that migrants are, being forced to, or being expelled from the United States, but to do it in chains on military planes. Pedro says, no, this is too far. This is one step too far. We can't do this. And he, reacts wildly to it and decides that he also is going to impose tariffs, but he also backed down. So, but then we have other cases, for example, the case of El Salvador. He has a more sympathetic president in El Salvador who apparently has agreed to to follow through on the safe third country agreement. And then today coming out with this agreement where apparently he's going to be willing to accept in these mega jails, not just migrants that maybe are from countries that the U.S. does not have a diplomatic relationship and is unable to deport them directly, but even U.S. citizens who are convicted of crimes. It's pretty extraordinary here. I made a comment on social media. This is the outsourcing of concentration camps. That's what's happening here. So I think a lot of it also depends on the balance of forces in every given country. One final note on Mexico that I want to say that I forgot to mention earlier, which is that, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum mentioned that she felt that she had the conviction, the ability to, really hold her ground in these negotiations with Trump, thanks to the overwhelming, that was the word she used, support that she's had from the Mexican population. Polls before this even went off had her at 80% support here in Mexico. That's extraordinary. And I think if they were to measure it today, given everything that's happened, it'd probably be above 90. I mean, that's unheard of. It's hegemonic levels of support, but it really does allow her to take this position. I think also because she knows that push comes to shove and Trump decides to do something that is aggressive towards us, that the Mexican population is going to be willing to shoulder whatever pain that may imply of sticking up for Mexico and standing up to the bully. So I think a lot of it has to do with the balance of forces in each respective country. But on a kind of broad way, I would say that for Latin America, it's a lot of more of the same, a lot more of the, regime change. And real quick, I think Venezuela is the best example of it. Biden called Edmundo Gonzalez, a stand-in candidate for the far-right opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, the legitimate president. And Trump, his State Department calls him the rightful president, right? So, it's like a different term that's trying to communicate the same thing. Although, in some ways, he can be more, the word that they use is transactional, as we saw this envoy being sent to Venezuela. And so I think we can exploit those things here in Latin America. There are ways that we can take advantage of this position that we find ourselves in when it comes to the U.S. Latin America relationship.
It's interesting, if I can just say 2 minutes, if it was a minute. And Jose Luis and I were talking about this earlier today. The first trip to Latin America for this new administration was with Grenell, special envoy, to Caracas. And he met with Maduro. So, you can imply a whole lot from that. And then the second trip is with the Secretary of State. And this week, he's been in Panama, Costa Rica, El Salvador. He's supposed to go to Guatemala and the Dominican Republic. And so it's interesting that Grenell went first and to Venezuela, and that the Secretary of State is pretty much an easy trip. Jose Luis, you and I said it's kind of easy. It's with, allies, countries that are already very smaller and already close to the United States. I do find the trip to Dominican Republic interesting this week, as Gustavo Petro was in Haiti last week, and in those, our neighboring countries. And Petro negotiated with the Haitian government agricultural deals. They talked about agriculture, security, drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms trafficking, and broad, Caribbean coordination. So it's interesting to me that, he was there last week, and amid all the kerfuffle between him and the White House, and then Rubio is going to the Dominican Republic as part of his trip.
I have a question. You, Terry, enumerated all of these military bases that the U.S. has in Latin America. It's overwhelming. And we've been talking about the tariff threats and the bullying and wanting to rename the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, and seize the Panama Canal. There are a lot of countries in Latin America. Can't they unite and organize in a way that is a coalition of resistance? Is there a discussion about this? Are there efforts along these lines?
Not only can we should. It's urgent. Unfortunately, actually, after the whole Colombia incident, there was a call for a meeting of CELAC. For those of you who don't know, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. It's sort of the anti-OAS. It includes all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, save United States and Canada. Right now, the president pro tempore, it rotates, it's Honduras, and she called for a meeting, but precisely because it sounds like some of the right-wing leaders in the region blocked the consensus from happening, the meeting was canceled. So that regional response hasn't happened yet, but it has to happen. And one of the things I've been saying in other spaces has been, well, if you can't have it at CELAC, then have an informal group, right? This is how urgent the situation is. You can't wait for these meetings to happen or to wait for the right-wingers to stop blocking these efforts, because they probably won't desist. They have a different strategy. They think they can get things out of Trump by, kissing his feet. And so the response from the region has to be more united, because otherwise he's going to pick us off. He's going to pick a fight with this country and that country over and over again until ultimately he secures what he wants, right? And I do think that there is a certain broader agenda happening here. It hasn't fully taken shape, but I do think, we shouldn't treat his expansionist threats as just mere bluster. There could be something behind that. And I think that means we better have our unity already established if that comes to happen, because if it happens and we're not ready, it's going to be a more difficult situation to get out of, and we'll be weaker as a whole.
I
You know,
appreciate.
this
Mhm.
mess that what I'm sorry,
I was gonna
Marcy,
say, I
didn't mean to
appreciate
interrupt.
that call to action. Mhm.
It's and super important. And this meeting that Jose Luis mentioned was an extraordinary assembly of SELAC last Thursday in response to Gustavo Petro request from Xiomara Castro, and it was all in the mix of this U.S. Colombia dialogue. It didn't happen because of lack of consensus, which means there are a split within SELAC. But also important to note that Colombia is going to be the next president pro tempore of SELAC, like next month or so, I think. So that baton is going to be passed from Honduras to Colombia within the next few months.
Just to
And so
clarify, was the conference, did it take place or did
it did not.
Okay. All right. Well,
Lack of consensus.
We'll talk more about Latin America. Do stay with us because I'm sure people have a lot of questions, and we're going to have a Q&A toward the end and ask Medea to join us. Right now, we're going to transition to Medea, who's just back from Cuba, who will tell us about her trip, but I want to give her a proper introduction. It's been a great honor for me for the past 4 years. I think it's been 4 years to co-host this show with Medea, who we know is the co-founder with Jody Evans of CODEPINK. And she was also the co-founder of the International Human Rights Organization Global Exchange. She is the author of how many books do you think? 11 books, including Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the US-Saudi Connection, Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. She is prolific. I can't keep up with Medea. I try, but I really do appreciate, I can keep up with our friendship. I appreciate talking to her all the time and staying abreast of what she's doing and watching all of these Instagram feeds. So let's welcome Medea. Medea, tell us about your trip to Cuba, what you saw, what you heard, who you were with, what's going on with Guantanamo. Tell us.
Yeah, well, wonderful to be on with you. I love co-hosting with Marcy and Hania, and also great to see Terry and Jose Luis again. And I thank Grace for all the work you do to make these happen. I just got back from Cuba, and it's interesting that you ended the other section on talking about why don't these countries of Latin America get together. When we just got back from a pretty extraordinary conference, it had people from, they said there were 90 countries. There were about 1,500 people there. It is called the Conference for the Equilibrium of the World. And the president of Cuba was there with us on the first day and the last day. And I must say, it's wonderful to be in a place where not only do you have people from all over the world who care about the world and the climate, and we talked about so many things, culture, economics, trade, climate, peace, but to also have a president that is sitting with you for hours on end, and every day he showed up, he was wearing a keffiyeh. And during the meetings, you would hear people break out with the chant of Free, Free Palestine. And, we're used to that happening when somebody comes to interrupt something that's going on as kind of a protest. And there it was just to show solidarity because everybody was in solidarity with Palestine. In fact, there are 250 Palestinians who have been in Cuba to study medicine. And some of those medical students were there during the conference with us and telling us about how this poor country, Cuba, has been so generous in providing scholarships for students around the world to come and to study in Cuba for free, with the only obligation that they go back to their communities and practice medicine in a poor community for 2 years. So, Cuba has provided many things to the world over the years. And what is very sad about Cuba right now is how poor it is. And this is something that hasn't been the case always. In fact, it was really once during the called special period when the Soviet Union dissolved that Cuba was left in a very difficult economic situation. And it built itself back up, and now it has fallen down again. in large part due to the sanctions from the United States, and also because of COVID. Cuba put a lot of resources into developing their own vaccines, into vaccinating everyone to make sure that Cuba took care of its people. And during that time of COVID, tourism just disappeared. As it did in other tourist countries around the world, people weren't traveling. And since tourism has become a main source of income for Cuba, that has really hurt the economy. And adding to that, when I say the US sanctions, there are two separate things. One are sanctions that have been on Cuba since the time of the revolution. In 1959 was the revolution. The sanctions began in 1960. They have been lifted a bit to some extent during some periods of friendlier US administrations, like during Carter and during Obama, but they were never totally lifted. Cuba has always been living under sanctions. And then on top of that, there is something called the terrorist list. And Cuba has been unfairly, unjustly, totally for political reasons, put on a terrorist list by Trump. And Biden, we thought he was going to lift Cuba from that in the first days in office. And instead, he waited until the last week in office, kept Cuba on that list for 4 years. And of course, Trump came in, and the first thing he did on his first day was put Cuba back on that list. We can talk about why Cuba shouldn't be on the list, but suffice it to say that Cuba is not supporting terrorism, quite the contrary. But what it means to be on that list is that the banks don't want to deal with Cuba. You try to do a GoFundMe and it has Cuba anywhere, it will be frozen. You try to send Venmo, you try to download an app on your phone when you're in Cuba, you can't do it. You can't use your credit card. Cuba can't use the international SWIFT financial system. It really wreaks havoc on the economy. And with the maximum pressure campaign that Trump had in his first term and now has imposed again with Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. And just as an aside, Marco Rubio once, as part of his career, has used his anti-Castro bona fides, but he lied and said that his family fled the Castro regime. It's not true. His family fled before Castro came to power. They fled the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, and Marco Rubio has never set foot in Cuba. And in fact, he just said, I think it was today, that he would never go to Cuba except if it was to talk to them about when the regime was going to leave. So in this hard line that Marco Rubio and Trump have on Cuba, they have already reinstated a few of the very few things that Biden had lifted during his time. For example, they now reinstated the right of people in the United States to sue Cuban companies, to sue companies and individuals that are using property that they say was confiscated from them in 1959. So imagine all of these decades later, they can sue for a piece of property. They did that to the cruise ships, saying that where they docked once belonged to a Cuban who now sued them. It didn't work in the courts, but anyway, it makes U.S. companies very much afraid to invest in Cuba. So there are, and in terms of the sanctions that make it so difficult, it's extraterritorial, and that means that it's not just the US. It means that any ship that docks in Cuba can't then dock in the United States for 6 months. As part of the extraterritorial nature, even travelers from Europe are not allowed to then travel into the United States without getting a special visa. So it makes travel and tourism from Europe hard. All of these things are just designed to find any little way that the Cuban government can make revenue and cut that off. And one of the big sources of revenue was the sending of missions of doctors overseas, that was quite an important source of revenue. And the US has come down hard on countries that are asking for Cuban doctors, saying that they will not give any kind of financial support to those countries, threatening them with trade sanctions for inviting Cuban doctors. It is really so heartbreaking. And what you see is that a country that once had a wonderful healthcare system and provided a ration system that made sure everybody had enough food to eat and a good education system is now having a shortage of doctors, a shortage of teachers, a shortage of food, a shortage of medicine. You might ask why the shortage of doctors? Because the salaries are so low that the doctors can't afford to keep working as doctors. And so they leave the country or they work in some area related to where they can make some hard currency, some dollars or some euros. So it is really very tragic. And the result is that there has been a massive migration from Cuba in the last few years, more than they've ever seen before. And where do most people go? Well, they go to the United States. And then you see the Trump administration saying that we have to stop these migrants from coming in, and it would be so easy to stop Cubans if they only lifted the embargo. Now, the conservatives in the US, and in the case of Cuba, it's actually almost the entire Congress, says that all of the problems in Cuba are due to the Cuban government and its mismanagement of the economy. And there is a lot of mismanagement, as there is in countries all over the world. But it's an ease, and that it's not the sanctions. And so the answer the Cubans say all the time is, well, then lift the sanctions, take Cuba off the terrorist list, and let's see what happens. Let the Cuban people then decide if all of their problems have come from the Cuban government's mismanagement, or it's also and especially come from the strangulation that the US has been imposing on Cuba for all of these decades. And finally, the one thing I want to bring up is the issue of Guantanamo. The US has a base in Guantanamo that it is occupied since 1898 and has, quote, leased since 1903. And the lease has long been up, and the US refuses to leave. And in fact, for a long time, it would send a check to the Cuban government, which they would never cash. And the US is now saying that it is going to use Guantanamo to house up to 30,000 migrants. Now, this is a place that, one, belongs to the Cuban people, two, has been so misused over the years as a place to house migrants from Cuba, migrants from Haiti during the 1990s. There were up to 14,000 Haitians who were there. And then what most of the people on this call will remember Guantanamo for was the Afghans and the Pakistanis and the others who were picked up, most of them absolutely innocent, and thrown into Guantanamo, almost 800 of them, held for years, some of them for decades, without trials, without, in most cases, even any kind of accusations formally put against them. So the place has been so misused, and now the flights have started today. They've already started with flights coming from a US military base in Texas that is taking people to Guantanamo. So it is a terrible thing to keep people out of sight from the US, to treat them however they want, to, a place where no laws apply. And it really is something we must fight against, and in the longer term, fight so that Guantanamo gets returned to the Cuban people. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Medea. There's so much that you share that we don't read about in the press, at least not the corporate press in the United States. So I hope you'll be sharing that on social media about the flights into Guantanamo. So disturbing. All right. So we have all of our guests here, Jose Luis, Terry, and Medea. Hani and I are here to ask some questions. And then after the question and answer period, I invite everybody to stay with us because we'll be making some calls to Capitol Hill saying, don't you dare seize the Panama Canal, etc. So, Hania, why don't you start with the first question?
Or something I'm very passionate about is, Medea, what you were talking about, the impact of sanctions on Cuban's economy and its people. What are the most effective strategies to counter the US's narrative that sanctions on Cuba are about promoting democracy, given that they're clearly a human impact, right?
I think an easy answer is to say it hasn't worked for all of these decades since 1960. How much longer do you have to wait to implement a project that just does not work? And what we say to our right-wing members of Congress is to say, why don't you try something different? Because certainly you're not going to be able to overthrow the government with sanctions. It actually makes the people more dependent on the government. But what you're doing is really making people's lives so miserable. And I think telling them that if they really cared about the Cuban people, they cared about their lives, they would want to see a lifting of the sanctions. And one of the issues that I didn't mention, in which they have just clamped down on as well this week, is the sending of remittances. You know, every poor country, people migrate to richer countries to then send money back to their families, called remittances. And Cuba is no different in that regard, except that the US government makes it difficult for Cuban Americans to send money to their families. So what I'm just hoping in all of this is that between the migration issues and the Cuban Americans who are hurt by these policies, there will be more people who will be speaking up to at least try to lift some of the worst aspects of these sanctions and the terrorist list.
Thank you, Medea. I have two questions. One is, tell us about Honduras and El Salvador. I've been reading that there's a split now between Honduras and the Trump administration, so I'd like to know more about that. And also, let's talk about Gaza, Palestine, Israel, Latin America. We've got these left-leaning governments, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Mexico, Cuba, submitting declarations of intervention in support of South Africa's case at the ICJ against Israel for genocide. I think you pointed out, Terry, that Mexico has an embassy for Palestine. Where do you see this going with Latin America and the United States and Trump's plan to try to push everybody in Gaza, it's ridiculous, into Jordan and Egypt? Where's this going? And also tell us about Honduras and El Salvador.
Well, can I first just piggyback on one of Medea's comments about the sanctions and the blockade on Cuba? Those are both forms of economic warfare, and they lead to migration. They create, it is one of the root causes of migration. And so if you want to stop migration and repatriate people, lifting sanctions is one of the first things that Washington could do. And you hear this a lot from Gustavo Petro in Colombia too. He clearly understands that a lot of the migration from Venezuela is a direct result of the sanctions, the economic sanctions on Venezuela. So it's, it creates a humanitarian crisis. Oh gosh, where do we start with Palestine and Latin America? There's a lot of countries that are in solidarity with Palestine, have been, Nicaragua being the first, I believe, in Latin America and the Caribbean in the 1980s under the first Sandinista government to recognize the Palestinian people as a nation. And Mexico had, I think, Jose Luis, until June of 2023, a special diplomatic mission related to Palestine. And in June of 2023, that was elevated to full embassy status. So there is an official recognition. Mexico has joined in the international case against genocide in Gaza, as has Colombia. Colombia has actually stopped certain exports, coal, I believe, energy exports to Israel. So there is solidarity in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think one of the things to understand is that so much of the Americas is, a result of colonization, of settler colonization, of conquering land via genocide. And so the history is similar. And there's a lot of really deep understanding of what's happening in Gaza right now. And that does create a lot of solidarity in the region. And so maybe Jose Luis, you want to talk a little more specific about how Mexico has interfaced on this issue.
Actually, on that question, it's interesting actually to think about the other way around, is everything that Israel has been involved with when it comes to human rights violations here in Latin America. If you remember the Chilean uprising a few years ago, one of the ways that they tried to impact that movement was deliberately shooting at demonstrators in the eye. Many people ended up blind as a result by so-called less lethal projectiles. And that tactic was taught to them by the Israelis, right? Israel has been very involved with many of the grossest regimes in the region around, so-called counterinsurgency trainings and things like that. So whenever you hear that kind of term, when you hear about the armed forces trying to put down a rebellion, chances are Israel was involved with that. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that now that there are progressive leftists in power, that they're kind of turning things back and actually criticizing Israel in the way that it carries out, right? Like it kind of in sort of really a grotesque way of saying it, right? Like they train their methods on the people of Palestine, particularly the people of Gaza, and then export it, right? And so you do see a certain commitment, and I think it's quite obvious to many people. We also shouldn't discount the symbolism, right? Claudia Sheinbaum isn't just the first woman president of Mexico; she's the first Jewish president of Mexico, and to have her take a firm position against Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people is actually quite important, because I think maybe some people were betting on her to be a proud Zionist, and she certainly hasn't. In fact, any public position she has ever taken has always been in support of the Palestinian people. And so that's also been encouraging to see. And yeah, I think it's important to us to continue to also use these international fora to really emphasize, right? Like the whole international so-called rules-based order, was built supposedly to get buy-in from the global South to say, but this is a system, and we can protect human rights. And so now that we saw this genocide being perpetuated for everybody to see and to see nothing happen, to say, well, we tried, right? We went to the International Criminal Court, we went to the to the World Court, to the Court of Justice, and you weren't able to deliver justice. And so, how much buy-in do you really think you'll be able to get from us when it comes to this? But nonetheless, saying, all right, you said that this is what this system is here for, so we're gonna, actually make you actually follow through on that. I think that's also really important, because again, it's not just about what you do to others could maybe happen to me, but the sense of belonging to a global community, of belonging to a global sense of humanity, of that responsibility to say that we will not tolerate these kinds of actions, I think is also really important and really encouraging to see from the region.
Marcy, you're muted.
Just briefly, if you could touch on Honduras and El Salvador. And then one last question that's been posted a few times in the chat is, can BRICS save Cuba or Venezuela or any country that is vilified and under the thumb of the U.S. war machine?
I'll answer the BRICS one real quick. So actually, Cuba and Bolivia are partner countries. So it's not actually super clear if that means they're not full members, but they're part of sort of the BRICS environment. Unfortunately, and I think this was actually a really big mistake on the part of decision makers at the last meeting, Venezuela is not a part of BRICS. And it sounds like maybe Brazil played a pretty big role in that. I think that's really unfortunate. It's sort of like cutting off your nose to spite your face. I think, the foreign policy establishment in Brazil wanted to send a message to Maduro over the results of the last election. It's a bit of a punishment, but they end up shooting themselves in the foot, because I want to quote my colleague Andreina Chavez from Venezuela Analysis. She's like, it's not about the other way. It's not like Venezuela needs BRICS. BRICS needs Venezuela, BRICS needs to send this message that, you know, these countries with huge amounts of resources, this is where they should be, because, you know, this is the whole point, to build this counter-hegemonic multipolar kind of space. And to not do that, I think, was a really big missed opportunity, but we can still push for it, right? Like, not all is lost. And I do think that, you know, the more time proceeds, the more that we see this emergence of a multipolar world, which really favors the global South, really favors Latin America in particular.
Just
Marcy.
lastly, Honduras.
Honduras.
What's going on with
So-
Honduras?
With Honduras, I think you're asking about the Sorocano Air
Mhm.
Base, the largest air
Yes.
base in Central America and the Caribbean. And, you know, in response to this current aggressiveness coming out of Washington, the current president, Xiomara Castro, has threatened to start charging the United States military for occupying and you know, managing that air base out of her country. And she's pretty adamant about it. And, you know, we support her voice and say, you're using our land. I mean, you're using our land, you're using some of our people, and you should be paying for it.
It
Yeah.
sort of
She didn't
reminds
say
me
she didn't say she'd throw them out. She wants them to, you know, if you're going to be here, we're going to charge you.
it
So-
kind of
The
reminds
the
me-
whole Honduras thing,
Yeah.
it points to something I think important to always keep in mind. You know, I always remember Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, at one point saying, "Mr. President Lopez Obrador, we're the United States. You will do what we say." No, there's this attitude that they think they can just kind of bully everybody all the time.
Yeah.
Latin American countries like Honduras, Mexico, others, they have cards that they can play. It is an asymmetrical relationship, but it's not like we're totally powerless. Thus, you know, there's a reason Trump backed down when it comes to tariff threats here against Mexico. He understands that, you know, if Mexico really wants to turn the screws on the US, it can, and it will probably affect his voter base first and foremost. So this idea that they can just do whatever they want and use it, like, that's not even true. It wasn't true in his first term, and it's definitely not true here in his second term. We have bargaining chips, and we should use them. I encourage Xiomara Castro to likewise do the same. Yeah.
Yes,
You
and
know-
I was going to say, it reminds me of people who turn on their friends. You know, it's like Joe McCarthy during the HUAC hearings, and he turned on the FBI, and that was kind of the end. So, you know, turning on Latin America, he's overplaying his hand. You know what? I think we
definitely.
could go on for a long time. This is a great conversation, but it's the top of the hour, and we usually have a Capitol calling party and some action. So I'm going to ask everybody to unmute and thank our guests before we move into the action portion of CODEPINK Congress.
All right. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
It's been such a rich discussion, and I so appreciate everybody who's been a guest, including Medea, our co-host, coming with all of this expertise and insight on Latin America. And with that, we're going to go to our Capitol calling party. You know, it's overwhelming, right? The raid on the Treasury, on the Social Security system, the Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico. You know what? I think I'm going to start calling, as Claudia Sheinbaum suggested, the Mexican president suggested, that we start calling the United States América Mexicana. And I like that. So I'm going to start doing that. But tonight, we are also going to talk about Latin America in the script, which Grace, thank you so much, Grace, for helping us out on these calls. We'll be posting in a minute, but basically it is to call, here's my phone, to call Capitol Hill to ask for your House representative or your senators and say, we want you to be very vocal. I'm your constituent. Here's my name. Here's my zip code. Please issue a public statement denouncing Trump's imperial threats to seize the Panama Canal and take over Greenland and Canada. And you can add to that if you want. We just heard Medea tell us that they're already sending in military planes detainees, refugees, immigrants over to Guantanamo Bay. Stop those flights. I ask that you also oppose Trump's billion-dollar weapons package for Israel. You can add whatever you want to the list. It's a long list, but that's the beginning. So I appreciate it if you would stay with us, and let's all make our calls.